Hannah knelt to wipe a spilled coffee stain from the marble floor when Mason strode past the entire executive board, coldly hurled her employee badge at her feet, and declared she was fired for tarnishing the company image. No one in that gleaming lobby knew the quiet, pregnant janitor was the secret heir the late founder had hidden for 3 decades. Minutes later, a lawyer arrived carrying a sealed envelope, and the whole glass tower began to tremble with quiet dread. Mason would soon learn he had just humiliated the one person who held his entire future in her hands. If you want to see how Hannah turned her fate around, stay with this story until the very last word. The story begins inside Langford Industries, a technology, construction, and clean energy conglomerate housed in a gleaming glass tower in the heart of New York. Mason Langford served as acting chief executive following the sudden death of the company's founder, Samuel Langford. On the surface, Mason appeared successful and sharp, a man who believed corporate image mattered more than personal feeling. Yet his hold on the position was far from secure because Samuel's final will had never been made public, and the entire board understood that everything could change the moment it was opened. Hannah Whitmore entered this world as a night shift janitor, dressed in a worn uniform, working quietly and keeping to herself. She was pregnant, though the story never centers on the unborn child directly. The pregnancy exists only to sharpen the stakes, the vulnerability, and the injustice she would soon endure. Hannah told no one that Samuel had secretly located her before he passed away. Decades earlier, Samuel had loved Hannah's mother, but family pressure and fear of a shareholder scandal kept him from ever acknowledging the relationship publicly. Before his death, Samuel had quietly arranged a DNA test, rewritten his will, and left Hannah the controlling shares of the company he had built from nothing. Eleanor Brooks, his private attorney, held every piece of proof, but a final legal procedure still needed to be completed before any announcement could be made. Hannah agreed to spend a short period working as a janitor inside her own father's company, wanting to understand it before claiming it. She needed to know whether Langford Industries still carried any trace of the man who built it, or whether it had hardened into something cold and hollow. Cameron Pierce, the company's ambitious chief financial officer, caught wind of rumors about a hidden heir. He had no proof of who she was, but he suspected the quiet new janitor might be connected to Samuel in some way he could not yet explain. Determined to protect his own position, Cameron began fabricating disciplinary reports, quietly shaping Hannah into someone who looked careless, clumsy, and difficult to manage. Grace Miller, the head of human resources, noticed inconsistencies in several of those reports but stayed silent, afraid of losing her job if she crossed Cameron. The story opens on the morning of a major shareholder meeting, the day Mason intended to prove to the board that he was tough enough to lead the company forward. Marble floors gleamed beneath glass elevators, and executives in tailored suits moved through the lobby as though the cleaning staff were invisible to them. It was in this cold, polished world that Hannah worked, unseen and unheard, carrying inside her both a child and a truth large enough to shake the entire tower to its foundation. None of them yet understood that the woman mopping the floor held more power over their futures than anyone sitting on the board. Mason had spent years learning to read a balance sheet, a market trend, a competitor's weakness, yet he had never learned to read the people who kept his building running. He walked past the same maintenance workers, the same cleaning staff, the same overnight security guards every single day without once asking their names. To him, they were simply part of the machinery that kept Langford Industries functioning, no different from the elevators or the air conditioning. Samuel had once been different, employees whispered, a man who remembered birthdays and asked about children. But that version of the company felt like a distant memory now. Eleanor Brooks understood the weight of what she carried better than anyone else inside that building. She had known Samuel for over 20 years, had watched him build an empire while quietly carrying a private ache he could never resolve. The sealed envelope in her office safe was not simply a legal document. It was a father's final attempt to make things right with a daughter he had failed to claim while he lived. Everyone in the tower was about to discover that fortunes built on silence eventually demand to be spoken aloud. That morning at Langford Industries carried the particular chill of a building built entirely for appearances. Marble floors stretched beneath glass elevators, executives in tailored suits crossed the lobby without glancing down, and everything about the space suggested control, wealth, and untouchable order. Hannah was wiping up a large coffee stain near the reception area after an assistant had accidentally knocked over a full cup. Cameron seized the moment and twisted it, quietly telling Mason that the janitor had made a mess right before major investors were expected to arrive. Mason walked in already tense, aware that the outcome of the coming shareholder meeting could determine whether he kept his position as chief executive. He noticed Hannah crouched on the floor, her simple uniform standing in stark contrast to the polished world surrounding her. Cameron leaned close and murmured that people like her were dragging down the company's image, planting the thought before Mason had time to consider it on his own. Mason did not ask questions, did not investigate, and did not pause to consider whether the story he had just been told was true. Instead, he chose the loudest possible response in front of everyone watching. He raised his voice at Hannah, declaring that Langford Industries had no room for employees who failed to meet its standards. Hannah tried to explain that she had not caused the spill, but Mason cut her off before she could finish the sentence. He turned to Grace and ordered her to bring the termination paperwork right there in the lobby, in front of dozens of witnesses. Grace hesitated, recognizing how cruel it would look to fire a pregnant woman in the middle of a crowded room, but Cameron shot her a warning glance that left no room for argument. Hannah placed a protective hand over her stomach, forcing herself to stay calm rather than break down in front of strangers. Mason tossed her employee badge toward her feet, creating what would become the most humiliating moment of her life. The lobby fell into an uncomfortable silence, and while several employees clearly felt sympathy, not one of them dared to speak up on her behalf. Hannah bent down and picked up the badge without begging, without pleading, and without raising her voice. She looked directly at Mason and told him, in a calm and steady tone, that some decisions follow a person for the rest of their life. Mason dismissed the remark as an empty threat from someone who had just lost her job and wanted the last word. Hannah walked out of the lobby fighting off a wave of dizziness, yet she kept her back straight the entire way to the door. Outside the building, Eleanor Brooks happened to witness the final moments of the confrontation through the glass entrance. She understood immediately that whatever fragile balance had existed inside that company had just been shattered beyond repair. Pulling out her phone, she dialed the probate court without hesitation, informing them that it was time to release the final sealed envelope left behind by Samuel Langford. The wheels that would eventually bring the entire tower to its knees had just been set into motion, though no one inside that gleaming lobby yet realized it. Inside, Mason returned to his office feeling a strange mixture of triumph and unease he could not quite name. He told himself he had simply enforced standards, that a leader could not afford to look weak in front of investors, that mercy had no place in a boardroom. Yet some quiet part of him kept replaying the steadiness in Hannah's voice, the way she had not flinched or begged, the way her calm had felt less like defeat and more like a warning. Cameron, meanwhile, slipped away to a private stairwell and exhaled in relief, believing he had bought himself precious time before anyone could connect the pieces he feared most. To understand why Hannah had been standing in that lobby with a mop in her hands, the story must rewind several weeks earlier. Hannah had grown up with her mother in a small town, never knowing her father's identity until her mother passed away and left behind an old, carefully hidden letter. In that letter, her mother revealed that her father was none other than Samuel Langford, the founder of Langford Industries. Hannah did not believe it at first, because the gap between her modest life and a billion-dollar empire felt impossibly wide. She eventually reached out to Eleanor Brooks, the woman Samuel had once quietly tasked with locating the daughter he had lost touch with. Eleanor confirmed everything through DNA testing, handwritten letters, old photographs, and financial documents that all lined up perfectly. Samuel had known Hannah existed, but by the time he found her, his heart condition had already progressed too far to allow much time together. He rewrote his will to leave Hannah controlling shares of the company, but he insisted she be allowed to decide for herself whether she wanted to accept that inheritance. Hannah refused to walk into the glass tower as an instant heiress expecting royal treatment. She wanted to see, with her own eyes, how the lowest-ranking employees were treated inside her father's company before she claimed anything. Eleanor arranged a temporary janitorial position under Hannah's real name, though the blood relationship remained completely undisclosed. What Hannah discovered troubled her deeply. Employees at the bottom were dismissed without dignity, contracts were quietly falsified, benefit funds were slashed, and workers were pressured into silence whenever they tried to speak up. She kept careful notes on everything she witnessed, not out of a desire for revenge, but out of a need to understand the truth of what her father's legacy had become. Cameron began paying closer attention when he noticed Hannah lingering near Samuel's old archived files. He had also seen her speaking privately with Eleanor in the parking garage on more than one occasion. Digging through personnel records, Cameron noticed that Hannah's birth date lined up suspiciously with a sensitive period in Samuel's past. He had no solid proof yet, but the possibility frightened him enough to act preemptively. Cameron made the decision that Hannah needed to be pushed out of the company before any will could ever be announced. He orchestrated a string of manufactured mistakes, a missing storage key, damaged paperwork, an unauthorized appearance on the wrong floor, a minor chemical spill blamed on her. Grace noticed that the signatures on several disciplinary reports did not quite match, yet Cameron pressured her into signing off on them anyway. Cameron stood beneath a portrait of Samuel hanging in the executive hallway and muttered to himself that a dead man had no business running the company through a secret child he had left behind. Hannah, unaware of the storm Cameron was quietly assembling against her, spent her evenings after each shift sitting alone in her small apartment, reading over her notes and wondering whether the company was even worth saving. She thought often of her mother, of the years spent wondering why her father had never come looking for her, and of the strange, aching relief that came with finally learning the truth even after his death. Grace, for her part, carried a growing weight of guilt each night, aware that her silence made her complicit in something she did not fully understand yet, but not brave enough to say so aloud. Somewhere beneath the polished floors and glass walls of the tower, three very different people were quietly building toward a collision none of them could yet see coming. To understand Mason fully, it helps to look beyond the cold executive who tossed a badge at Hannah's feet in front of a silent crowd. Mason had grown up as a distant relative in Samuel's extended family, someone Samuel had supported and mentored, but never truly considered a blood heir. He had always felt the need to prove himself twice as hard as anyone else in that world, carrying a quiet insecurity beneath his polished exterior. After Samuel passed away, the board elevated Mason to acting chief executive because he was decisive, understood the markets, and knew how to speak confidently to investors. Yet Mason remained haunted by the fear that people saw him as nothing more than a temporary placeholder. Cameron exploited that fear relentlessly, frequently reminding Mason that some hidden heir could appear at any moment and take the seat right out from under him. Mason had no idea who that heir might be. All he knew was that Samuel's final will remain sealed and unopened. Under that mounting pressure, Mason began to convince himself that softness was nothing but weakness in disguise. He ordered cuts to lower-level staffing, tightened control over the company's public image, and pushed for everything to appear flawless before the upcoming shareholder meeting. Grace attempted to warn him that firing Hannah without any proper investigation could expose the company to serious legal risk, especially given that she was pregnant. Mason brushed the warning aside, assuming human resources was simply being overly cautious as usual. Cameron handed Mason a thick folder of fabricated records suggesting Hannah had violated company policy on multiple separate occasions. Mason skimmed through it quickly, distracted by preparations for his upcoming investor presentation. This moment revealed his greatest moral failure. He held real power over another person's life, yet he could not spare even a few minutes to listen carefully before acting. During an internal leadership meeting, Mason declared that Langford Industries needed to eliminate disorder starting from the lowest level of the organization. Cameron carefully filed that statement away, recognizing it could later serve as proof that Mason had personally driven the decision to fire Hannah. When the coffee spill incident unfolded in the lobby, Mason saw it as the perfect opportunity to demonstrate strength and decisiveness. He never suspected that he was simply performing a role Cameron had carefully staged for him from the very beginning. Just after the firing, Mason walked into the shareholder meeting believing he had successfully restored order out of chaos. But the moment he began his presentation, the chairman of the board's phone buzzed with an urgent message from Eleanor, announcing that Samuel's final will was about to be revealed that very same day. Mason had always measured himself against an impossible standard, one shaped by years of watching Samuel praise other executives while offering him only cautious, conditional approval. He told himself that once he proved his worth through hard numbers and investor confidence, that old ache of never quite belonging would finally disappear. What he failed to notice was how much that same ache had hollowed him out, making him quick to judge and slow to listen, especially toward anyone who reminded him of his own fragile position. Standing at the podium that morning, feeling more powerful than he had in months, Mason had no idea that the ground beneath his feet was already cracking apart. After leaving the building, Hannah sat down on the stone steps outside, caught between physical exhaustion and a fierce effort to hold herself together. Eleanor approached and gently urged her not to endure this silently any longer. Hannah's first instinct was still to walk away quietly, unwilling to let her unborn child grow up shadowed by a bitter inheritance battle. Eleanor reminded her that this was never only about money. It was about responsibility toward thousands of employees currently being squeezed by Cameron and his allies within the company. Hannah finally made her decision and signed the documents formally accepting her inheritance. Eleanor immediately sent an urgent notice to the board, demanding that every decision made by the acting chief executive be frozen until the will could be properly announced. Inside the boardroom, Mason was in the middle of presenting the company's future outlook when the doors suddenly opened. Eleanor walked in accompanied by two legal associates carrying the sealed envelope bearing Samuel's signature. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Cameron's face went pale, though he fought hard to maintain his composure. Mason grew visibly frustrated, believing the attorney was disrupting an important meeting with investors watching closely. Eleanor announced that, according to the terms of the will, all temporary voting authority had to be suspended immediately because the controlling heir had officially come forward. The room erupted into murmurs. Mason demanded to know who this person was. Eleanor did not answer right away. Instead, she placed an old photograph of Samuel and Hannah's mother on the table for everyone to see. She then revealed the DNA results, a supplemental birth certificate, Samuel's handwritten letter, and formal certification of the inherited shares. The name Hannah Whitmore echoed through a room that had, less than an hour earlier, treated her as nothing more than disposable staff. Mason froze completely. Grace realized with a jolt that the very woman just fired in the lobby was the legitimate future owner of the entire company. Cameron tried to push back, insisting the documents could easily be forged. Eleanor calmly produced the official court filing number along with a notarized confirmation. One board member asked where Hannah currently was. Eleanor answered plainly that Hannah had been personally fired by the chief executive himself less than an hour earlier. A heavy silence settled over the boardroom as Mason slowly understood that throwing that badge at her feet might cost him absolutely everything he had worked so hard to build. The chairman rose slowly from his seat, staring at Mason with an expression somewhere between disbelief and dread, while Cameron's hands trembled slightly beneath the table where no one could see them. Somewhere far below in the lobby, unaware of the storm unfolding 2 floors above her, Hannah was quietly gathering her things, ready to walk out of the building she had just unknowingly inherited. For Eleanor, this moment carried a weight far heavier than any ordinary legal proceeding. She had promised Samuel in his final weeks that she would carry out his wishes exactly as written, regardless of how uncomfortable the truth might be for the people left behind. Watching the color drain from Mason's face, she felt no satisfaction, only a quiet sorrow that it had taken public cruelty to finally force the truth into the light. Grace, seated near the back of the room, pressed a hand to her mouth, replaying in her mind every warning sign she had chosen to ignore over the past several weeks. Cameron alone seemed to be calculating rather than reeling, his mind already racing toward whatever desperate move might still save him from the consequences closing in around him. The board insisted that Mason go find Hannah and bring her back immediately. Reluctantly, Mason made his way down to the lobby accompanied by Grace and several board members. He spotted Hannah near a side exit, a small canvas bag in hand, clearly exhausted but still standing tall. For the first time in a long while, Mason found himself unsure of exactly what to say. He tried to sound professional, explaining that there had been a misunderstanding and asking her to return to the boardroom. Hannah looked at him steadily, without gloating or raising her voice, and asked whether he was inviting her back because she was a human being or simply because she now held controlling shares. The question left Mason speechless. Grace began crying softly and apologized to Hannah for failing to protect her earlier. Hannah did not immediately blame Grace, though she made clear that she expected honesty from everyone once the full truth came out. When Hannah walked back into the boardroom, every single executive rose from their seats out of respect. The same people who had refused to even glance at her in the lobby now found themselves unable to meet her eyes directly. Cameron forced a fake smile, addressing her respectfully as Miss Whitmore. Hannah said nothing in response. Eleanor laid out the full details of the will. Hannah controlled 52% of voting shares, held the authority to retain or remove the chief executive, and possessed full power to launch an internal investigation. Samuel had left behind a personal letter stating that whoever was worthy of leading Langford Industries needed to understand the value of the lowest-ranking person inside the building. That letter left several senior executives visibly ashamed. Mason realized in that moment that Samuel had designed one final moral test for the entire company. Hannah chose not to fire Mason immediately, even though she had every right to do so. She explained that her first decision would not be revenge, but a thorough investigation. She ordered that all personnel files, internal emails, lobby security footage, financial records, and disciplinary reports connected to her case be sealed and preserved without exception. Cameron began to genuinely panic. Hannah took her seat at the head of the table, the very seat once occupied by Samuel himself, and placed the badge that had been thrown at her feet earlier onto the table as the first piece of evidence in what was to come. Mason watched her do it, and something in his chest tightened uncomfortably, a feeling he would later recognize as the first honest flicker of shame he had allowed himself to feel in years. Grace stayed close by Hannah's side throughout the remainder of that meeting, quietly noting names, dates, and details she had once been too frightened to write down. She understood now that her silence had never actually protected her. It had only protected Cameron, and it had cost Hannah something no apology could fully repair. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances, aware that the culture they had allowed to fester under Mason's leadership was about to be dragged into full view. As the meeting adjourned for the day, Cameron lingered near the doorway a moment too long, his mind already turning toward whatever move he could make before the investigation closed in around him. Hannah appointed Eleanor to oversee an independent investigation into everything that had happened. Mason was required to step back from all personnel decisions until the truth had been fully established. Grace was called in as the very first witness. At first she feared for her career, but seeing how calmly Hannah carried herself despite everything she had endured, Grace finally decided to tell the whole truth. She revealed that Cameron had pressured her into signing incomplete disciplinary reports. Security footage confirmed that Hannah had never caused the coffee spill in the first place. One of Cameron's own assistants had deliberately knocked over the cup and quietly left the scene afterward. Access logs from the archive floor showed that Cameron had repeatedly entered Samuel's old private files without proper authorization. Internal emails revealed that Cameron had been actively searching for information about a secret heir for several weeks beforehand. The more evidence Mason reviewed, the quieter he became. He began to understand that his mistake was not only trusting Cameron blindly, but also allowing his own pride to override basic fairness. Hannah discovered that Cameron had been quietly diverting money from the Employee Welfare Fund into a shell consulting company under his control. This transformed the story from a wrongful termination into a much larger scheme of financial fraud. Cameron tried shifting blame onto Mason, insisting that every staffing cut had ultimately required the chief executive's approval. Mason could not fully deny it, since his signature appeared on several of the relevant documents. However, Eleanor pointed out that many of those documents had been quietly altered after Mason had signed the original versions. Cameron began to find himself increasingly isolated within the company. An information technology employee named Logan provided backup server records proving that Cameron had deliberately deleted incriminating data. Hannah understood that announcing everything too soon might allow Cameron to flee or destroy further evidence. She decided to convene a special emergency board meeting the following morning. Mason requested a private conversation with Hannah, but she declined his request. She told him plainly that before he could offer any apology, he first needed to learn how to hear an uncomfortable truth without immediately becoming defensive. That evening, Cameron placed a phone call to an outside contact, warning them that, unless Hannah disappeared from the company entirely, all of them stood to lose everything they had built. Grace overheard fragments of that same phone call through a partially closed office door, and for the first time since the entire ordeal began, felt a surge of real fear for Hannah's safety, rather than simply fear for her own job. She immediately relayed what she had heard to Eleanor, who instructed extra security to remain stationed near the executive floor throughout the night. Hannah, informed of the threat, refused to let fear dictate her next move, insisting that the investigation continue exactly as planned. Mason, still technically barred from personnel decisions, found himself pacing his office long after everyone else had gone home, turning over Cameron's words about shared blame again and again in his mind. Somewhere beneath his wounded pride, a harder truth had begun to take root. Even if Cameron had orchestrated the scheme, Mason's own carelessness had given him exactly the opening he needed. That night, Hannah remained behind in Samuel's old office to read through her father's private letters. There was no dramatic gathering, no noise sale celebration. Only Hannah alone in a dim room, absorbing the delayed words of a father who had already passed away. Samuel had written that he was not asking for forgiveness, only hoping she would one day wield power more wisely than he ever had. For the first time since arriving at the company, Hannah allowed herself to cry, not over money or ownership, but over the lost chance to ever ask her father why he had stayed silent for so long. Meanwhile, Cameron arranged to have part of the executive floor locked down and disabled several of the secondary security cameras. He intended to retrieve the original sealed envelope along with the hard drive containing critical evidence against him. Hannah heard a faint noise coming from the records room nearby. Because she was pregnant, she chose not to rush toward danger. Instead, she stepped back and immediately called Eleanor, along with internal security. Cameron appeared moments later, no longer bothering to maintain any pretense of politeness. He told Hannah she was nothing more than a fortunate janitor who understood nothing about running a billion-dollar company. Hannah calmly replied that a company does not collapse because of its janitors. It collapses because of people who assume no one is watching them. Cameron attempted to pressure her into signing away her controlling interest, claiming it would prevent a damaging media scandal. Mason arrived unexpectedly, alerted by Grace only minutes earlier. This moment presented Mason with a genuine chance to choose differently than he had before. This time, he did not raise his voice at Hannah, and he did not listen to Cameron's demands. Instead, he physically placed himself between Hannah and Cameron. Cameron mocked Mason, suggesting he was only protecting Hannah out of fear of losing his own position. Mason admitted that he had made serious mistakes, but insisted that his failures gave Cameron no right to continue committing new ones. Security arrived quickly, and Cameron attempted to flee through an emergency stairwell but was intercepted on a lower floor. The hard drive containing crucial evidence remained safely secured. Hannah felt shaken by the tension of the confrontation, yet she refused to let the moment spiral into unnecessary drama. She insisted that the scheduled meeting proceed exactly as planned the following morning. Afterward, Mason stood alone outside Samuel's office, staring at the nameplate reading Chief Executive Officer mounted on the door, seeing it for the first time as something he had not yet truly earned, and wondering quietly whether he ever would. Grace, watching Cameron get led away by security, felt no satisfaction, only a hollow kind of relief mixed with regret for having waited so long to speak up. Eleanor secured the recovered hard drive in a locked vault, aware that its contents would form the backbone of everything the board needed to see the following morning. Hannah returned home well past midnight, her body aching with exhaustion, yet her mind unable to rest as she replayed her father's letter over and over. She placed a hand gently on her stomach and made herself a quiet promise that whatever came next, she would not let this company make the same mistakes twice. The following morning, the entire board of directors, outside counsel, independent auditors, and representatives of the largest shareholders gathered together. Hannah walked in wearing modest but dignified clothing, making no attempt to transform herself into a glamorous billionaire overnight. The old employee badge still sat inside the folder placed in front of her. Eleanor laid out the complete chain of evidence: the legally valid will, the controlling shares, the fabricated reports, the security footage, the incriminating emails, the diverted funds, and the attempt to coerce Hannah into giving up her inheritance. Cameron was suspended on the spot, and his file was immediately handed over to investigators. He tried dragging Mason down with him, claiming that Mason had personally created the cold, indifferent culture that had made everything possible. Hannah did not deny that accusation outright. She stated plainly that Cameron had committed crimes out of greed, but Mason had enabled them by treating human beings as nothing more than expendable costs. That single sentence struck Mason far harder than any legal penalty ever could have. The board urged Hannah to take over as chairwoman immediately. Several members pushed for Mason's outright termination, wanting to make an example of him. Hannah surprised everyone by refusing to act out of impulse or anger. She required Mason to stand and answer directly to the entire board. Why had he fired her without any investigation at all? Mason remained silent for a long, uncomfortable stretch before finally admitting that he had feared losing his power far more than he had feared hurting an innocent person. This admission marked the very first step in his slow transformation. Hannah decided to suspend Mason from his role as chief executive for 90 days rather than dismissing him outright. During that period, he would be required to cooperate fully with the investigation, personally meet with every group of employees whose benefits had been cut, and present a detailed plan to repair the company's damaged culture. Hannah was formally appointed as controlling chairwoman, while Grace was placed in temporary charge of restructuring the human resources department. Employees on the lower floors learned the news through an internal company announcement and, for the first time in a long while, allowed themselves to believe real change might actually be possible. Hannah left that boardroom not as a triumphant winner celebrating victory, but as someone who had just accepted an enormous and unfamiliar burden. She paused briefly in the hallway outside, resting one hand against the cool glass wall, taking a slow breath before facing whatever came next, fully aware that the hardest part of this journey had only just begun. Behind her, the boardroom slowly emptied as members filed out in stunned quiet, few of them able to look directly at Mason as they passed. Cameron was escorted from the building under watch, his composure finally cracking as the reality of consequence caught up with his ambition. Grace lingered by the window, watching the morning light spread across the lobby floor where, only a day earlier, a badge had been thrown at a woman's feet without a second thought. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Grace allowed herself a small, cautious sense of hope that the company might yet become something worth being proud of again. In the weeks that followed, Langford Industries entered a period of considerable turbulence. News spread quickly that the chief executive had wrongfully fired a pregnant secret heir without any real investigation. Stock prices wavered, the board grew anxious, and employees throughout the building spoke of little else. Hannah refused to exploit the scandal for personal attention and turned down every request for a sensational interview. She issued only a brief public statement, saying that Langford Industries would ultimately be judged by how it treated the people who held the least amount of power within it. Cameron faced formal investigation for financial fraud, falsifying records, and obstructing a rightful inheritance. Several executives connected to his scheme were forced to resign from their positions. Grace was given a genuine opportunity to correct her past silence by launching a confidential reporting line specifically for employees. Mason was required to spend time in the company's service departments, including the warehouses, the janitorial staff offices, maintenance crews, and customer support teams. At first, many employees refused to speak with him at all. Mason accepted that reality without complaint or resistance. He listened as one maintenance worker explained that cuts to the health fund had caused wife to lose her insurance coverage entirely. He listened as another janitor described being instructed to disappear from the lobby whenever investors visited the building. These stories steadily dismantled the flawless image of the company that Mason had once believed in without question. Mason eventually wrote a detailed personal report, one that placed no blame whatsoever on Cameron. He openly admitted that he had led through fear and reputation rather than genuine responsibility toward the people who depended on him. Hannah read his report carefully but withheld forgiveness for the time being. Instead, she focused her energy on rebuilding company policy, stronger protections during pregnancy, a firm ban on public terminations, mandatory investigations before any disciplinary action, and full restoration of the employee welfare fund. She also established an internal training fund to help lower-level employees pursue advancement within the company. Slowly, the tower itself began to feel different from the inside out. By the final week of that period, Mason personally placed Hannah's old employee badge inside a small glass case within the leadership training room, a quiet reminder that real power begins with how a person treats those who appear to hold the least of it. Employees who passed that display each morning found themselves pausing, if only for a moment, to consider what kind of leader they wanted to become. Hannah, watching the company slowly shift beneath her guidance, still allowed herself moments of quiet doubt about whether real change could outlast the initial wave of scrutiny. She met regularly with Eleanor, going over every new policy line by line, determined not to let good intentions dissolve into empty gestures once public attention faded. Grace, meanwhile, found herself fielding a steady stream of employees eager to share concerns they had been too afraid to voice before, each conversation chipping away at the culture of silence Cameron had built. Even the building itself seemed to breathe differently, as though years of accumulated tension were finally beginning to loosen their grip on the people who worked within its walls. 3 months later, the annual shareholder meeting took place in that very same lobby where Hannah had once been fired. The space looked outwardly familiar, still gleaming with marble floors and glass walls, yet this time employees from the lowest ranks were invited to sit in the front rows. Hannah arrived as the controlling chairwoman of Langford Industries. She made no effort to hide her past as a janitor within these same walls. Standing before the shareholders, she briefly shared that the worst day of her life had shown her exactly what the company needed to change. Cameron was formally charged, his fraudulent assets frozen, and his remaining allies removed from the organization entirely. Grace was allowed to remain because she had cooperated fully and used her second chance to genuinely protect employees. Mason was invited to speak after successfully completing his 90-day suspension. He publicly apologized to Hannah in front of the entire company, offering no excuses about pressure or misunderstanding. He admitted that he had looked at a janitor that day, but had failed to see a human being standing in front of him. Hannah listened carefully, but she did not turn the moment into a hasty, sentimental reconciliation. She stated clearly that forgiveness did not mean forgetting, and that power should never be handed back simply because someone delivered a well-crafted apology. Following Hannah's recommendation, the board voted that Mason would not immediately return as chief executive. Instead, he would serve as director of operational reform under independent oversight. A neutral leader with a clean record was appointed as interim chief executive, while Hannah retained her position as chairwoman. This outcome felt appropriately balanced. Mason received a genuine chance to make amends, yet he still faced real consequences for his actions. Hannah walked out of the building afterward and looked up at the Langford Industries sign, no longer seeing it as some distant, unfamiliar symbol. She rested a hand gently on her stomach, thinking not of a child appearing within the story itself, but of the fairer future she now intended to protect. The woman once forced to pick her badge up off a marble floor no longer needed to raise her voice to reclaim her company. She only needed to stand back up, hold on to the truth, and watch an entire empire finally learn to bow its head in respect. Behind her, the tower's glass doors closed softly, and for the first time since she had walked through them as a stranger in a worn uniform, Hannah felt something close to peace settle over her, quiet and steady, the way morning light settles over still water. She did not look back at the building rising tall behind her because she no longer needed its approval to know exactly who she was and what she had built out of the wreckage of that one terrible morning. Ahead of her stretched a future she intended to shape with the same steadiness that had carried her through every humiliation, every doubt, and every quiet act of courage that had led her to this moment. And somewhere inside that tower, a badge once thrown in cruelty now rested behind glass, no longer a symbol of shame but a permanent reminder of exactly how far one overlooked woman had risen. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for someone else to notice their worth, but Hannah proved that quiet strength eventually speaks louder than any title or boardroom voice ever could. A single act of cruelty tried to erase her, yet it only revealed exactly how much power she had carried inside her all along. If this story moved you, carry a piece of it forward. Treat the quiet person in the room as though they might be carrying more strength than anyone realizes, because sometimes they are. Thank you for staying until the very last word of Hannah's journey, and may you always remember that true worth is never measured by a title, a paycheck, or a uniform, but by the courage someone shows when the whole world underestimates them completely.